Even AI as it exists today is already democratizing a lot of, access to the law. I think that's only going to keep advancing. Whereas in court, judges have to hear both sides. They have some leeway, but they can't just at first glance be like, nope, this happened 3 months ago. You don't need 10 years. You get 6 months. You get this. Frankly, where we should have started is the ability to turn over every rock.
What are you most excited by or proud of in your career in the legal profession? We could start with a little bit about your background and New Era ADR. Like, what is New Era ADR and why did you found it?
New Era is, in one sentence, it's a dispute resolution platform, right? But unlike any other that has existed, solving that problem, that age-old problem of why does it cost so damn much to resolve a legal dispute in this country? And more broadly, which leads into the why is, why is it? It's challenging that kind of long accepted paradigm that like, why is it that we all just assume that a legal dispute, right, just automatically means it's going to be highly expensive, highly distracting, take up a lot of time. And that's how we all approach, whether as individuals or as companies. And so the reason we started is because, my co-founders and I, so my background, I have an engineering and legal background, engineering by background, went into law. I've been a lawyer for almost 18 years now. Started in intellectual property and then went into like IP investment banking. And so kind of a non-linear career in law, but frankly, I wouldn't have had it any other way. So when I was doing the kind of banking work, brokering a lot of technology transactions on the buy side and sell side, but also building a market in Taiwan and Hong Kong, actually, for a couple of these companies. I'm an early adopter of everything. And so wanted to be closer to the tech. And so joined 2 different tech companies, where I was leading legal departments in the 11 years leading up to, the launch of New Era. So the first one was a financial technology company. The second was a data science company, both really interesting companies. And frankly, the data science company was, AI before what it is today. The actual machine learning, the training of the models, how to ETL data, right? All those things that you need to do before you can even build an LLM. And so, did that over 11 years. But the reason for New Era was, a common pain that my co-founders and I shared. And so there's 4 of us who started it. All of us have experienced this pain, which is simply that like when there's a legal dispute, we just have that underlying assumption that it's going to be very expensive, very time consuming. And so even though the main dispute's expensive, what it does is it actually impacts, right, how we approach that problem. Right? Whether you're a company or an individual. And so using an example of, let's say, employment disputes, and we know this is true, right? Companies deal with a fair share of, frankly, false and, frivolous employment lawsuits, which we can get into, David, about like why the U.S. is so litigious and why, it's so easy to file a lawsuit. But companies deal with a good number of these. And what do they do right now? Instead of defending them, when they didn't do anything wrong, they often will pay a settlement. But why they pay that isn't because they did anything wrong. It's because the cost of showing that they didn't do anything wrong takes 2 to 3 years and hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of dollars, right? And a lot of distraction to the core business team, not just the legal teams that are managing, right? And so it's a pain avoidance settlement and not so much a culpability settlement. But on the reverse, if how many employees have truly been screwed over or, wronged by organizations, and how many of these people aren't bringing these suits because it's the same calculus for the individual. Like, well, if I go after this company, I don't know how long it's going to take, right? And I need to go find another job, or I need to work, and I have a family and I have kids. And this company also has way more resources than me. And so if they really wanted to play hardball, they could drag this out for years. And I can't engage in this. And so they don't bring these at all. And so the company's not held accountable. And so the reason all of this happens, on both the individual and company side is, and this was, the root cause that, my co-founders and I identified is, well, our existing systems, right? The court system, legacy arbitration systems, they were built, hundreds of years ago, literally, or, 60 to 100 years ago. And so these are old systems that were built, for kind of one size fits all, right? And our thesis was the majority of legal disputes, right? So there's a tiny subset of legal disputes that we think should stay in court or stay in these legacy arbitrations, right? If there's some massive securities fraud, or like there's a contract to build the next airplane and something goes wrong. All that stuff should stay in court. But frankly, and especially for a lot of the folks in your audience, right, who are business owners, that kind of run the business type disputes, right? Kind of like issues with your vendors, issues with your customers, issues with your employees, issues with your founders and business partners, those things, or the high volume stuff, right? So for some folks who have, let's say, call centers or like staffing, a lot of contractors, or even consumer disputes, the run the company and like high volume disputes, our thesis is always like, why is it that like none of this needs 2+ years, to resolve? And frankly, everybody involved in these disputes, because we knew it, we were former lawyers ourselves in companies, we know that like people just want this done. They just want a resolution. They want their day. They want to be heard and then get a resolution. But nothing exists for that. That's what New Era is. That's why we built it. New Era is a 100-day arbitration. So 100-day legally enforceable legal decision, legal resolution on your disputes, all for one flat fee, right? And so there's not only time certainty, but cost certainty, and then all fully online. No need to do this in person. Even though it's 90% faster and more efficient than anything else that exists today, still the same quality, arbitrators and mediators, the people who are actually adjudicating your case, still the same quality folks doing it. And so you're getting the same quality, kind of resolution that you would get anywhere else. So that's the why. We launched about 4 years ago.
You brought up, or I think you kind of insinuated incentives and how certain cases can carry on for years. I think that you also highlighted some of the benefits to having litigation or arbitration as an option for the disenfranchised or disempowered employee, for example. And there seems to be this intrinsic double-edged sword to everything that we do. So anything that's good has a bad side, anything bad has a good side. And so I don't know that there's a perfect kind of way. It's like, this is always going to be uncorrupted. When you look at like the pharmaceutical industry, for example, there's a business case for people being sick. Whether or not people are taking advantage of that is probably a separate issue. But the fact that one could make a business case, I think there's always going to be people that will try to gather resources and conserve energy. And so that could be cheating on an exam, that could be lying to a colleague. And that's, I think, always going to be a case. And it forces people, like competitors, let's say, to be on their toes. There's always going to be some level of competition. It seems like this very challenging formula to balance where you're ethically competitive. When you look at the US, for example, you mentioned it's a very litigious society. My numbers were off before we started recording with Japan. It's actually around 44,000 lawyers in Japan and about 1.3 million in the US. And if you look at the proportion of the population, that's about a 30x increase in the number of lawyers relative to the population in the US. So there is like a 30x increase in lawyers. Now, there are some benefits to the US. I think the US seems to be one of the best places to be an entrepreneur. I mean, there's many attributes you could mention, but perhaps like a runaway train, there could be a toxic element to an overly litigious society. And being that this is part of your business model, I mean, this industry that you're in for 18 years, what are your thoughts like regarding, did you think that some of the concerns about legal is a bit inaccurate and people are just like misinformed and this is actually a net value add? Or do you think it's a bit of a mixed bag and that's kind of what New Era ADR is trying to address and be like, let's have a fair and balanced, like you said, flat fee, 100 days, this is what it is. And does that, I guess, mitigate some of the perverse incentives that I might touched on where a bad actor, let's say, could have exploit an opportunity, just be like, I don't like people who wear that type of shirt or whatever. So I'm going to, find a case against it or something.
I think it's a mixed bag. I think, as we were kind of talking about before the recording, yes, the US is very litigious, but I think, at the same time, what's the alternative, right? For like a society built on laws, right? The ability for people to seek recourse when they've been wronged, I think is very, very good, right? And so how we're trying to insert ourselves is not so much, stopping recourse or anything. It's saying here, once you've sought recourse, let's have just a few more options for people, and right size the path to recourse, right? For depending on the complexity and the type of case and what's at stake. And that's what was missing. And that's the gap that we're trying to fill, is the existing systems all kind of have one path, which is a path which rightfully I think is a good default, right? And frankly, where we should have started is the ability to turn over every rock, right? And that's what the existing system allows, is you can fight endlessly, right, about different procedural issues, the evidence at stake, and of course, before you even get to what actually happened, right? And I think that's right, because you have to have that in place, because there are going to be cases where you do need to turn over every complex cases, high stakes cases, many people being hurt. Those are things where you want to make sure you explore that case very fully. And our existing systems allow that. The reality is, and what most business owners face is, fortunately, we're not hurting a bunch of people all the time. We're not, engaged in giant trade secret theft. It's the everyday kind of run the company, high volume cases. Most people just, on a day-to-day, whether you're a business owner or an individual, where like these are the things where now the existing system isn't a great fit because of everything else, an individual or an organization has going on. An organization's job is to grow, right? And to make customers happy and not to be litigating in court. But hey, disputes happen, disagreements happen. That's just a reality. Same with individuals. They have life, they have, work, they have everything else going on. They don't want to be in this. And so, but you still need to have that path to a resolution, right? The last thing you want is people not having a path or being kind of almost feeling like they're constrained because the existing paths are so onerous that, it's almost going to be more painful to go, seek the way to right the wrongs. And so that's what New Era is doing is, all right, we're saying, spend 100 days doing it instead of 2 years. And here's that path to finally do that. Because of, our backgrounds, especially as a founding team, we've seen that over and over and over, both in like the corporate world, but also in the individual world, whether it's with like friends and families, from the pro bono work we do, and just seeing individuals who are also just kind of victims of, this inability, lack of a path to like just a fast resolution on what they're dealing with.
Law seems like one of many industries where a larger player has an advantage, more lawyers, more resources. Do you see maybe AI or certain advancements in the industry kind of leveling the playing field, so to speak, so that there's more, let's say, equality in law?
Absolutely. I think even AI as it exists today is already democratizing a lot of, access to the law, right? And I think that's only going to keep advancing. Whether it's, from an individual level, allowing people to at least like really get up to speed on what their issue is, how to navigate the courts, how to navigate, how do I right this wrong that I experienced? All the way to the lawyers themselves, right? Tools that are making it, allowing them to be far more effective, spend more time on kind of more strategic and substantive matters and less time, on, some of the stuff that frankly could be automated away. I think AI just makes everybody a little more efficient. It democratizes the knowledge. And I think law is definitely, and you're seeing it in the legal industry, where AI is truly kind of a huge difference maker, right, in the legal industry.
You mentioned also earlier how some of the, going back, we both mentioned it, how some of the cases can drag on. Could you give us like kind of a little peek into some of the biggest games that parties play to delay or inflate legal costs?
Well, going back to that same employment example, right? Games on both sides. Organizations may take advantage of the many procedural kind of tools that are available to them, right, in a lawsuit to, ask for delay, to kind of continue delaying the case, push things down the road, right? And sometimes engage in a little bit of like obfuscation that forces the other side to then, use procedural tools to try and get them to like do the next thing that they should be doing. And then vice versa, right? And one of the most common ones that you'll see is, and this is all, you'll see like one theme is around like what's called discovery, which is like evidence exchange, and you'll see, one side or the other, right, start asking for absurd things from the other side, right? Like, let's say it's two companies going at it. And let's say it's a very simple, vendor customer dispute, one side, if they want to play games, could be like, well, I'm going to need 10 years worth of documents and records. And, I need to depose everybody in your C-suite, right? And what that does, though, is even though they may not necessarily get that, what that does is it kicks off this long series of court procedures where then the other side's telling the judge, like, I don't think they need all this. I think this is an unfair, overly broad ask. I think they only need this because this happened 3 months ago. Why do they need 10 years worth of records? This only involved, one employee, and maybe you only need to talk to their manager. Why do they need the, depositions of the CEO, the CFO, and everybody else? Those arguments take months, right, in court. And one side knows that. And so a lot of times that's part of the game is I'm going to create a lot of this hassle, knowing that this is just going to keep extending the litigation. You're going to have to spend a lot of time writing these long briefs, explaining to the judge why this is overly broad. The other side, 3 months later, is going to write their brief, right, saying this is why I think we deserve it. Then maybe another 2 to 3 months later, you finally have a hearing on just that little subject, right? And that's the thing that a lot of people, I think, especially outside of law, often doesn't realize, that like a lot of litigation in court, very little of it is about what actually happened, right? It's a lot of this procedural stuff. And then if you do make it a trial, which is very rare, that's when you really are like hearing what actually happened. The rest of this is all the procedural stuff leading up to it. But this is also why a lot of people settle, is they just want to avoid this process. But that's wrong, because frankly, it should be about what happened, right? And less so about the procedural stuff. So that's one example of games.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And as someone who's outside of law, you shared a little bit about your background. You've been involved in some really impressive things, clearly a driven professional. What are you most kind of excited by or proud of in your career in the legal profession?
I think the thing that I'm most proud of, with all the different organizations I've been a part of is, and it kind of dovetails into, how I view, the role of lawyers is, that like I enabled a lot of kind of bolder ideas, right? In the organizations that I've worked with, because there's different types of legal counsel, right? And frankly, whether it's in-house counsel inside a company or the law firms that you use, they're the lawyers who, like, we've all been trained to identify all the risks, right? But then there's the lawyers who then kind of stop there and basically allow the risks to hamstring any sort of efforts, that their clients might want to make. And their clients could be individuals, their client could be the organization, or if they're in-house, then it's one organization. But then there are the other lawyers who, I think really, take a broader view, understand the business, understand the technology, like whatever the company is doing, and have been able to design, solutions, not just legal solutions, but sometimes product-driven solutions, operational, business-driven solutions around this perceived or actual legal risk. And so that's one of the things that, I've always enjoyed and that, I'm definitely proud of because, for example, my last company was a data science company, right? And as I mentioned, it was AI before what it is today. It was predictive analytics, it was data science. We were handling a lot of sensitive data, right? But it was before a lot of the laws that have passed, right? Both in the US and in Europe and worldwide, these privacy laws. And so one was making sure that, the company always had its moral compass pointed north, thinking through the ethical issues, but then still enabling, right, how we use, potentially client data that clients give us, other data that we've gone and licensed, and a lot of it is personally identifiable information. And so that's using this as an example, right? How to help that company then grow, be able to build a lot of the exciting products we built, right, without violating people's privacy, without misusing data. And so it's one of those challenges where, you could see that going many different ways. If, somebody else was in that position, we're like, wait a minute, I don't even know where the law's going. So we have to stop all of this, right? To, well, here's where we think it'll go. Here's how I think we can do this and still, make sure we're doing right by, the people whose data we have, but, still serving the product.
When I was younger, I used to think that I had all the answers and like the world was just they're getting it wrong, and I just give it to me for a day, I'll fix everything. And as I learn more, I realize I have no idea how to make it better. What you just brought up, I think like law is nice. It's a nice like guardrail kind of thing, but you need like kind of personal morals and ethics, because you mentioned like you were ahead of the law in data science, and you see that in social media and other technology, and it's always going to be the case. Like how could you, in order to innovate, you're going to be ahead of what exists.
Yep.
And so you need this kind of balance between personal ethics, and maybe my personal ethics are different than your personal ethics. And so how do you make sense of that? And so it's really complex, it seems. And law is kind of an evolving, and maybe now with AI and open information, it's a little faster, fast following to innovation, and hopefully more flexible. It sounds like some of the infrastructure might be a little bit dated to a slower moving industry or society. But with what you're doing now with New Era ADR and getting it down to 100 days, you mentioned sometimes the games that people play, like kind of arbitrating over like how much data should be disclosed or whatever, and delaying the case. How can you keep a case to 100 days if people are playing these games, or do you subvert that somehow?
We try and subvert that, and so far I think relatively successfully, right? And it's a combination of both rules, financial levers, and then technology levers. And so rules themselves, right? So what arbitration is, as kind of quick background, right? In the US, we have the Federal Arbitration Act, right? Which, allows for arbitration. And at the end of the day, what it allows for is for two parties to agree privately to how they want to resolve legal disputes. It doesn't necessarily need to involve any of the existing arbitration platforms, us or any of the legacy ones, right? It could just say, David and Michael decide that if we have a legal dispute, we will resolve it this is who we will choose to oversee and help us and help rule on this dispute that David and Michael have. And this is how we want it to go, right? It could be as simple as that. And that's still arbitration, right? And I know I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's really what it is at the end of the day, And so going back to, how we subvert it, the rules though, all the legacy forums also have a whole set of rules, right? But those are the rules that lend themselves to all these games. And so for us, we wrote our own set of rules without being beholden to any of this stuff. Because again, at the end of the day, it's two parties. And so when I say people adopt New Era, right? And real quick, adopting New Era simply means writing us into your contracts, right? So at the end of every agreement you've ever signed, any terms of use you've ever clicked through, there's always a clause at the very end of every contract that says, if we have a legal dispute, we will resolve it in, the courts in Manhattan or, this legacy arbitration forum. People are crossing that out and simply putting in New Era ADR. And so that by virtue of doing that, you've adopted us, because in that contract, which two sides agreed to, that's one of the terms of the contract. You've both agreed to it, right? And so it's important to kind of just explain that as background, because then when we write the rules, people who come to New Era, they've already agreed to our rules because their contract has said, we're going to resolve our legal dispute on New Era according to their rules, and using the way they select their arbitrators and mediators. So that's step one, is the rules themselves. We've written them in a way that gives the arbitrators and mediators the power that's frankly a lot of judges and other arbitrators don't have. So, for example, kind of quickly reduce the scope of like the 10 years worth of documents and, the depositions of the C-suites that I mentioned earlier, to be able to say, you know what, I don't need that to understand what's going on in this case to rule on it. So therefore, why do you need that? And no, you don't get that then, right? And so kind of unilaterally be able to do that, right? Whereas in court, judges have to hear both sides. They have some leeway, but they can't just, at first glance be like, nope, this happened 3 months ago. You don't need 10 years. You get 6 months. You get this, right? So that's one layer. The next is, how we incentivize our arbitrators and mediators. So they're not rewarded for allowing a case to drag out, for instance, because, in many cases they bill hourly, right? And, not saying that like most arbitrators have the integrity to still want to be efficient, but hey, just by definition, an hourly billing model is not conducive to efficiency, right? They're kind of almost like, opposed to each other. And so we don't compensate them that way. And then lastly, our tech platform, right? All of us come from the tech industry. We're fortunate to have, like my former head of product, my designers, engineers want to come build with us, from my previous companies. And so these are folks who've taken very complex things like AI, like genomics AI and everything, and made it simple, right? And so the platform itself facilitates a lot of the document exchange, facilitates a lot of that, what we actually like to call ourselves, like kind of the boring stuff, but frankly, the base user experience, right? So that it's very easy to understand. It's easy to exchange documents. It's easy to get all the tasks done. And so it's a lot of these different layers, all these different levers kind of, work with each other to keep these things to that 100 days and to subvert, right, these games that you were asking about.
You actually touched on another question I was going to ask you. Should startups incorporate alternative dispute resolution clauses early on to help safeguard them down the line? And you touched on that, just putting in the ADR. I didn't even know that was an option. So thank you for sharing that. Is there any other kind of tips that you would encourage business owners to adopt in a preemptive fashion?
Yeah. Well, so certainly, of course, I would advocate for New Era, and that it makes sense to adopt New Era. But more broadly, I think, yes, it's worth business owners thinking through, right, or telling their lawyers, whoever they work with, to think through, hey, if something came up, a disagreement came up, what are my mechanisms to get that resolved, right? Because, as you're starting a business, any type of business in any industry, rightfully so, you're laser focused on, what's the problem I'm solving? How am I going to delight customers? Whatever product I'm making, whether it's a pizza or a software platform, how am I going to make that as awesome as possible? And that's great. But then we all know that disputes, unfortunately, are just a reality of life and business. And so that's actually the thing that ends up being really distracting and that a lot of people overlook, right? And so you can't ever prevent a legal dispute from happening, but you can certainly think about how you want that resolved if and when it happens, where you're well positioned to efficiently get rid of it so you're not distracted from growing your core business, but at the same time, also not acquiescing to it, right? And that's why, of course, for us, that's why we built New Era, just by virtue of putting us in, your supplier agreements, your online terms of use, your employee agreements, and everything else that a business has as they're starting, your partnership agreements between partners. That just by virtue of doing that and putting New Era into those contracts, that, like, God forbid a dispute comes up, at least that's going to be done quickly. At least it's not, frankly, it's also not going to be acrimonious, right? In 100 days, there's just less time for people to play the games that cause the other person or the other party to just truly dislike or almost hate them, right? And so it's another reason just to, like, preserve relationships, whether it's with customers, suppliers, partners. Something comes up, deal with it directly. If you can't deal with it directly, kind of, person to person, fine. Go to New Era. A third person will make a call, an arbitrator, but at least you won't be dragging this out, and you'll have your release, right, in like having your day in court, so to speak, because you will present your evidence. You will, go on a hearing and present, you or your lawyer can present your arguments. And so you've at least, that's the thing that I think eats at a lot of people, is that a lot of times currently in the legacy systems, people resolve these by these settlements or walking away or never bringing a case. But then what's left is you're just hanging on to this acrimony, and it's just not healthy for anybody, right? And so that's a long way of saying, absolutely, I think, especially earlier stage, but whether you're an early stage company or, Amazon, it just makes sense, right? There's always a subset of legal disputes where you're like, this stuff, I just don't want taking up my time and energy. But if it comes up, I need it resolved correctly based on what actually happened really, really quickly.
You mentioned incentives there. And I think what I took away when you said that was, as a business owner and perhaps even just as a person, when you think of your North Star, think about aligning incentives to reward progression in that direction. I think sometimes that's overlooked. It's almost like that kind of line about the paper, like AI making a perfect paperclip or something that turns the whole world into paperclips because it's just like set and forget instead of incentivizing kind of what you want. you brought up Hong Kong and Taiwan earlier. I don't know if this is accurate or kind of like the telephone game, like mistelling, but I heard that Chinese doctors, I don't know if it's current or before, pay the patient when they're sick. So, and whereas in the US, it's the other way around. So there's actually an incentive to be sick. And so if there's like an incentive of your team or of the whole kind of, legal system to get cases through fairly and quickly, then I think, of course, there's always going to be exceptions, but I think in large, that would incentivize a more, I think, of, I guess, a good faith dispute.
Exactly. And you hit on that exactly. At the end of the day, we just want something done, a resolution in good faith, right? Based on the facts and what actually happened. Absolutely.
You invest in frontier tech like AI, nanotech, and Web3. Could you tell us what threads you see in these emerging sectors that might surprise us?
It's interesting. Threads. Again, as an early adopter, I love this kind of stuff. And so, for me, it's like what I look for, of course, and it's not directly answering your question. I mean, what I look for is, of course, the founders, the size of the market, the problem they're solving, and especially for my few frontier tech investments, it's more, is it, it sounds lofty, but is this really going to have an impact, a real impact on humanity, and improve quality of life or improve, in some cases, like, what Elon Musk is doing with some of his initiatives with Mars, like, the continued existence of humans. If you were to believe that, Earth, could one day not be habitable. And so it's things like that I see. And so the through line, though, I would say is, it's clearly very ambitious founders, who are dreaming big. I'm not sure if that directly answers your question. I'll kind of stop there.
It does. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's fine. It was intended to be an open-ended question. I guess what I took away from your answer there is it typically is a growth mindset type of industry versus a zero sum type of industry. And perhaps that attracts a particular profile and particular conversations and collaborations and stuff like that. Is that fair to say?
That's fair, for sure.
It's exciting. I'm fascinated. I think that the next few years are probably going to be some of the most pivotal years that we've seen.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about venture capital in the startup space. Now, could you explain a little bit New Era ADR's kind of relationship to venture capital?
Yeah, so we have several venture firms on our cap table who are investors. From the earliest round that we raised, part of that was also venture backed. We raised a seed round that was led by venture investors. And then we did this, I like to call it an opportunistic round, to get some key strategic investors onto our cap table. And that was kind of largely driven by, one venture investor, which kind of got us to open up the extra round, get additional capital in, but then get a few other strategic folks in.
Some of the criticism I hear about venture capital, again, double-edged sword, is that it's expensive money. And you brought up the notion of strategy, like the kind of network and the access that they can provide you. And so it's more than just money. Could you talk about kind of the calculus that you as the founder went through versus like bootstrapping or just doing friends and family round? Why did you decide ultimately to land on venture money?
I think a few different things, a few different factors. One, the nature of the business. Two, and I think this is something that all entrepreneurs also have to be, have to think about, is being very honest with, their current situations, right? And then three, right, like the pros and cons of having venture investors. And so one was the nature of the business, which is we knew that, like, we saw the pathway. We knew how we were going to go after the market. And we knew from like ourselves being lawyers, but also a lot of just the early conversations before we launched, like how we were going to sell this, and the fact that there was going to be good reception. At the same time, we also knew that we were the population we were selling into is lawyers, right? And so the interesting thing about lawyers, the one side that people know is, well, they're very risk averse. And we know that. And they're not going to be the earliest adopters of anything, right? And so we knew that there was going to be a little bit of a slower ramp, when it comes to, the customer base, the revenue base, and everything else, versus, right, like potentially, the consumer app that just goes viral and you suddenly have a ton of users and that's great. And so because we anticipated a little bit of a slower ramp up front, that also, contributed to our thought around, well, we need a longer kind of just, capital base and runway to get to that inflection point that we know will hit. And so that's also where then, the venture investors come into play, because while we did raise from friends and family and other angels, of course, the venture investor just allows, just a bigger check into the company. So is that. And then the other thing, from the personal aspect was, the four of us who started this, we're all very experienced operators. We've all, been in early stage companies, been in law firms, been in other companies, leading departments. But what comes with experience sometimes is also life, which is, well, we all have families. And so we also need to pay ourselves a living wage, right? Because, unlike when we were maybe 25 or 30, when we could have, not taken any salary, we needed some salary. And so that's just a reality. And it was a thing we told our investors, like we will pay ourselves a little bit. And so it was all these different factors that led us to say, all right, let's raise that venture round versus bootstrapping. Like certainly we could have put some money in, but not the amount that we thought would have gotten the business to, a long enough of a runway to get us to that next point, right? And of course, that's one of the things with early stage companies, whether you're a tech company or, just a corner store, if you're undercapitalized and you don't have enough runway to get to the next phase and to keep growing until you're this kind of self-sustaining business, well, that's why a lot of organizations, have to close up. So all these different factors, went into the decision to get venture capital. But then it was really sitting down and, vetting the investors. And so we were very fortunate at every stage to have, multiple term sheets, right? So multiple investors interested in investing, wanting to invest, committing that their terms. And so we were able to have choice. And so from that perspective, we recognize that we're very blessed, very fortunate. And so it was finding investors who really understood, the vision, how the pathway there, understood that the trajectory was going to be unlike probably some of their other venture investments where, they're looking for just a straight line up. This is going to be a little bit of a different path, but that straight line up will be there. And really sitting down with these folks, getting to know them, and then fortunately, I like to think, I think we've picked some, really, really good investors to have on the cap table. They've been very supportive, willing to, talk through difficult ideas, talk through strategic ideas, make intros to, whether it's customers, other just kind of thought leaders and people who can, we can just bounce ideas off of, as we're kind of thinking and growing this business. So they've proven to be, really valuable. But that's just one path, right? Certainly there's bootstrapping and a lot of other paths.
Where do you see the future of the legal industry moving? Let's say this decade, the next 3-4 years.
I think AI is going to have a big impact. I think, a lot of, and you're already seeing it. You're already seeing a lot of tasks in a lawyer's day-to-day work that, frankly, AI should be taking over to free them up from a lot of this stuff to work on more meaningful things. At the same time, you have to train the next generation of lawyers. And so, what does that look like? And there's a lot of different schools of thought around this. And, we actually think New Era plays a role in that in terms of like the litigation world, giving lawyers, a whole set and whole volume of legal disputes where like the more junior lawyers can still handle some of these smaller cases, right? Like you can't have a junior lawyer handling a multi-billion-dollar litigation, but the $500,000 one, the $3 million one, employment case, all these things, this is actually a really good training ground for younger lawyers. And so I think a lot of that, I don't have a crystal ball and I can't tell you exactly how lawyer training is going to change. Certainly a lot of different ideas out there. But that's going to evolve, right? And then at the same time, I think to our discussion earlier, a lot of the law and the access to the law will be democratized because of AI tools out there. And so hopefully, that means that you also have one, just a better informed client, right, for anybody who is seeking a lawyer, but then also just empowering individuals, right, to kind of help themselves. And right now, that's a big problem in this country is, kind of the justice gap is, kind of like what it's often referred to, where you have, a big population of folks who need legal help, but then very few kind of lawyers who can provide it, right? Because sure, there's pro bono services, right, and legal aid, but then a lot of people make too much money, quote unquote, to qualify for legal aid, and yet they still can't afford a lawyer. And so how do you help these folks, right, get the legal help they need? And I think technology is going to play a big role in this, to help these folks. And frankly, to make the lawyers more efficient and, potentially be able to have more resources and time to help these folks.
Sounds like a win-win. That's what we're hoping for.
Hopefully, yeah.
So neweraadr.com is the website. I see you've got the fee schedule transparently featured on there. People can download, as well as more information about the founding team and your services. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to point people to get in touch or follow what you're doing?
You could always reach out directly to me. It's rich.lee@neweraadr.com. But otherwise, the website has a lot of the information.
Well, you have had an impressive career so far, and I'm sure a lot of exciting times ahead. Thank you, Rich, for talking to us today. You have some really great insights.
Thanks so much, David. This is great.